That would be great. are here today because China has a plan and is carrying out a strategy to become the world's digital superpower. The strategy, in part, has been offering their sophisticated AI-driven big data, surveillance, and censorship models to the rest of the world. This is because Xi Jinping believes that whoever dominates the digital world dominates the material world. My name is Valerie Shen, and I lead Third Way's National Security Program. We have an amazing group of speakers with breathtaking expertise and dedication, and a fascinating program. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us, and to those watching through DoD or Third Way's live stream. And a special thanks to Team Third Way for their outstanding efforts to make this event happen, especially to Jason Browder, our Senior Policy Advisor for National Security, who you'll be hearing from more during our panel. Third Way's digital world order. What does that mean? This new initiative is about how it is absolutely essential for the US and our like-minded allies to set the digital world order grounded in our core democratic values if we are to have a stable, secure, democratic-led planet in the 21st century. This initiative will propose and further ideas so that the contest between digital democracies and digital authoritarianism is won by our open worldview. Right now, the outcome is unclear. Many countries are taking China's tech, with all of its authoritarian strings attached. Why? It's easier when there's simply no democratic alternative. With Huawei 5G infrastructure, the choice for many was to accept China's rules or just not have high-speed wireless internet. That's part of China's plan. China's propaganda apparatus pushes the narrative that US democracy and other democracies are too dysfunctional and too messy to work in the 21st century. That is also part of their plan. The US will need to dig deep, figure out, agree upon, and then execute our own plan to win. The whole of government, big tech, businesses, civil society, and yes, even Democrats and Republicans passing laws together, and ideally starting as soon as possible. There is no easy, obvious path forward to preserve the liberal world order we've grown accustomed to. The US-China relationship is unavoidably complicated. To compete, but also to avoid unnecessary conflict, maintain peace, and work on transnational issues of mutual interest, such as nuclear nonproliferation and climate change. But if we lean into our American strengths of innovation, determination, and global leadership, if we can be the country that won the space race and invented the internet, and if we are the country that rallied the free world to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and democracy, we can win. That is why I'm excited to be leading this US-China program with a commitment by bipartisan. I'm also excited as a second-generation Taiwanese American because I believe a deeper understanding of the Chinese language, culture, and history is a crucial piece to passing this difficult geopolitical test. For example, the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is 卧虎藏龙 in Mandarin, literally, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. But a much better contextual translation would be people of hidden extraordinary talent. Mandarin uses many metaphors, idioms imbued with meaning over thousands of years of history and literature. This idiom comes from an ancient poem. 暗时以藏虎, 盘根是卧龙, or there's probably a tiger hiding behind that rock, and those roots resemble a crouching. The takeaway is that beings of immense power, can be nearby, but hidden or unnoticed. In the movie, 3 women of exceptional fighting skill are oppressed by their gender roles or conceal their abilities from the unsuspecting. As a national security, we are constantly missing the full context and layers of meaning. Our understanding, communications, and strategy can only suffer going forward. As an Asian American, and with the ongoing rise of violent anti-Asian hate crimes, which I don't imagine will improve as China comes more into public focus, I also feel strongly that Asian Americans have a special role to serve their country, and particularly that Asian American women and men take visible leadership roles. That is why I'm so grateful that fellow Chinese American and my predecessor at Third Way, Mieke Eoyang, will be sharing her expertise on our panel. In 1949, all my grandparents fled for their lives from the Chinese Communist Party. My grandmother, Nai Nai, at the age of 28, took her infant and 5 other children on a refugee boat to Taiwan. The deck was so crowded and chaotic that the woman standing next to her accidentally smothered her infant to death. Nai Nai passed last year at the age of 100, and at her funeral, my aunts and uncles spoke of the sheer will and determination she needed to get all 6 of her children safely across. My parents were later born in Taiwan and immigrated to the US, where I was born. Nai Nai immigrated with them and took care of me growing up. Nai Nai never really learned English, so maybe others would disagree. But to me, she was the embodiment of the American spirit and the freedom our country stands for. So I believe deeply that this global competition is not about speaking English or Mandarin, East versus West, your ethnicity, religion, culture, or what holidays you celebrate. It's about your values and what world you want your children and their children to live in, with freedom of speech, expression, human rights, privacy, and security. To quote a great man, the late Chairman Elijah Cummings would often remind us, his staff, that, quote, "We are in a fight for the soul of our democracy, to keep it intact for generations yet unborn." He was focused on the fight at home, but I think he'd agree that it's also true for the fight abroad. Thank you. Now it is my great honor and privilege to welcome to the stage 2 highly distinguished guests and leaders on US national security policy. So I'd like to just start out by asking both of you about the stakes that our US-China competition has and the urgency for the United States to win it in both the digital and technological spaces.
First of all, great to be here with Third Way, and really appreciate your opening remarks. I think you set the tone just right in terms of what you described. But we are undergoing as a society, as an economy, a huge digital transformation. This is going to define how we compete in the world generally, but also will have huge national security implications. And so it's really a critical moment where we need to do everything possible to keep on the cutting edge of technology, but also to show up in the world and help to shape the international norms that are going to define digital governance. The danger is that if we fail to do that, several things could happen. There's a danger of China exporting its authoritarian model, which includes a number of things like ubiquitous surveillance, tracking of the population, censorship of media and social media, state control of the internet access, digital walls or firewalls. even the use of social credit scores, which have been used to control populations, expropriation of sensitive data and IP, versus a democratic model that would enshrine all of the values that you mentioned. There's also a danger that if we don't compete, Chinese hardware, Chinese software will become the backbone of the global digital infrastructure, and that could be used for exploitation and also cyber espionage. And there's actually I'm so sorry about this, but there's actually the even greater danger of proliferation of disinformation designed to undermine democracy, portray it as feckless, weak, dysfunctional, etc., divide us from our allies, and influence the domestic public opinion. So the stakes here are really, really high, as you said, and I believe that whoever sets the global digital order, the rules of the road, will really have tremendous leverage diplomatically, economically, and militarily, because this competition that we're in will be waged as much in the information sphere as any other.
And Mac, do you have anything to add?
I agree with everything Michèle said, which is always a good place to start. I think in the piece that y'all wrote, Valerie, you said that this is a competition between two systems, autocracy and democracy. Some people are uncomfortable saying it's a new Cold War and there are clearly differences, but there are two sides. And that competition or adversarial relationship will manifest itself in a number of ways, but the digital domain is one of the key ones. And there is nothing we do virtually in national security that does not have a digital dimension. But our economy is also dependent upon digital information. Our personal lives are dependent upon it. So as Michèle was saying, it goes to our values and how we function as a society. And if China were to become the digital superpower, all of those things would be at risk.
So first I'll pose this hypothetical. If China were to become the world's digital superpower, what kinds of threats would you be most concerned of, or do you think would have the largest impact on our everyday lives as Americans?
Well, I would start out by going back to this surveillance technology that is important for China to control their own population, but also they are exporting it to more and more countries, which obviously allows those countries to use those repressive methods, but it's also tentacles from Beijing that reach into South America or Africa or other parts of the globe. So if you look at the bigger picture, I think this approach and the technology that goes with it to digital surveillance, giving people scores on how much you criticize the government, et cetera, I think that's a huge issue. I've got to point out, though, and I'll hate to quote him, but Putin, I think, is reported to have said, whoever controls AI controls the world. Certainly, it is going to be, it is already important. It will be even more important to a functioning military, to a functioning economy. And so you just pick these examples of where being the digital superpower gives you a tremendous advantage, not in a one-on-one competition, but your system, your approach is going to overwhelm the other. That's the way I would think of the danger.
I would just add, if we characterize this as a race, China's winning right now. They are actually ahead of the U.S. and the West. And what are they doing? They're exporting cheaper telecommunications infrastructure, systems like Huawei to much of the world, not only to create that physical infrastructure and dependency on it, but also to spread the infrastructure that they would use to provide tools of surveillance to other countries, but also tools of espionage for Beijing. They are showing up in force at international fora where internet standards are being set. They actually have given a name to this initiative, the China Standards 2035 project, as you noted in your written materials. And we are not showing up in the kind of way that we need to be effective yet. I think this administration aspires to do that. They're integrating these digital offerings into their core diplomacy. So think of a digital Belt and Road Initiative. So they're trying to gain leverage and influence in various developing countries around the world in key regions where usually there's some kind of economic interest for the Chinese as well. They're doing that with digital offerings. And they're also continuing to steal and setting up the infrastructure to continue to steal billions of dollars in Western intellectual property, to continue to conduct surveillance and espionage using digital means. So what the U.S. really needs right now is to, first of all, have a national strategy and build a coalition of like-minded states to have a strategy and start competing with the Chinese, not necessarily symmetrically in the same way that they're doing it, but asymmetrically in ways that play to our own strengths.
So Michèle, in a November 2021 Washington Post event on digital transformation of the military, you talked about how the U.S. was the best military in the world, and we've thought of ourselves as that, but if we simply rested on our laurels, that won't remain the case. And so we have to invest in new technologies, operational concepts, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing business if we're going to keep our edge. And I feel like you already partially answered that question, but is that also your current assessment of what's going on, that we are resting on our laurels? And if that's the case, what needs to happen to really move us out of that space?
Yeah. No, I think, we are the place where the internet was born. We have this unrivaled innovation ecosystem in Silicon Valley and Austin and, Route 128 around various places around the country. We, are the world's premier cyber power. We have a lot of things where we tell ourselves we are the best in the world. But if we stand still and we don't make the necessary investments in technology, in people, in concepts, in approaches, we won't stay that way. And particularly when it comes to the military domain, which is what I know best, China and Russia and other powers have gone to school on our way of warfare. Ever since the first Gulf War, they've spent 20 plus years investing in ways of countering our conventional superiority. Some of those ways are in the digital, in the cyber, in the AI domain. And again, if we don't, and with authoritarian systems, they sometimes have better success of accelerating the scaling of new technologies than we do, where the Pentagon still struggles to buy commercial technologies and integrate them at speed and at scale. So we have a lot of work to do that we can go through a whole bunch of different recommendations, but we have a lot of work to do to kind of get out of our own way, to be able to fully leverage the strength, the innovation strength that we have and the technical strength we have in this country.
So, Meg, I know you've worked a great deal about trying to give the U.S. military edge, keeping its edge in technology, trying to get over, I think you both spoke of the valley of death. So for those who don't know, maybe you can speak a little bit to that, and where are we with that, and how can we fully utilize our private sector to make sure our military has the best innovation possible?
Yeah, well, really it takes off exactly what Michèle was talking about. So we have the most innovative private sector in the world. The challenge is, too often, it's hard for them to do business with the government. And so the valley of death generally refers to initial funding that will try something out or build a prototype, but then because of the delays in our system, before it can be taken up by one of the military services, this often small, innovative company is just left there with people to payroll to make, and trying to figure out how they're going to survive until the government gets its act together in 2 or 3 or 5 fiscal years in order to give them funds so that they can build a bunch of whatever it was. So and there are different valleys, but I think the broader point is we have tremendous capability, but we still make it too hard for the private sector to do business with government. We focus mainly on DoD, but it's true across the government. And I'd say one other thing kind of related to that is because we believe in limited government, we tend to think, okay, that's the government's job, and this is the private sector job, and this is individuals. The Chinese don't think that way. It's not just a whole of government approach, it's a whole of nation approach. And I'm not saying we should be like them, but I am saying when it comes to some of these cyber and digital areas, it is a question of national security. It's also a question of economic security and individual rights. And we can't afford to think in silos. We're going to have to understand that these things cross domains, even though that's not really our tradition.
Yeah. And oftentimes it's really, the government doesn't have to put all of the capital on the table to fund everything, but the government needs to be able to send a clear signal that this is something that we need, then we will be buying. They need to place some big bets. They can, whether it's bridging the valley of death to help companies get to full-scale production of a new capability, or whether it's placing some research and development bets or creating funding. The CHIPS Act is a great example of a big bet. We want to diversify and grow more American capacity for manufacture of semiconductors. Another one could be, we should be investing at the same kind of, well, not the same level, but a substantial level to create a competitive multi-cloud ecosystem, meaning, because everything is going to be in the cloud in the future. And we are tending to favor one or two big companies. We need a really healthy ecosystem, and government can appropriate monies and guide how those monies are spent in a way that gives us much more resilient ecosystem of players, much as we have done on commercial space. You have a really, increasingly robust and resilient commercial space industry because of how people like Mac and others on the Armed Services Committees and elsewhere seeded that area with some government funding, and then that government funding drew private capital based on that signal.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about bipartisanship, because we have a Democrat and Republican sitting here on stage with us. So U.S. policy on competing with China seems to be perhaps one of the few remaining areas of major bipartisan agreement. But given just how divisive our politics are these days, I don't think progress is a foregone conclusion. So what do you both see as the greatest challenges or opportunities going forward for bipartisan work?
You live this. I'm going to let you start.
Oh, thanks. No, Michèle's right. I think there is no real difference in the parties on how they see the threat from China right now, and that's a good place to start. There are always going to be fringe elements in both parties that dissent, but the challenge is for the broad center of the country to and of the Congress and of political opinion to stay together. And going back to the example Michèle gave a while ago, I think the CHIPS Act is a really good example. Okay, we understand because of COVID and now the Ukraine that we're vulnerable because we can't domestically, we don't have a reliable supply of chips. I mean, obviously concerned about what percentage Taiwan provides. So we're going to do something about it because relatively few bills get passed these days. It becomes a wish list and everybody starts putting everything on it. But in recent days, the leadership in Congress is saying, hey, we got to pare this down, just do the essential part that we can agree upon, which, by the way, will fund something that was authorized a year and a half ago, so could have done it a little sooner. But pare it down, do what we can agree on, and move forward. And if that's our approach, it's going to require some political restraint. You're not going to get exactly what you want when you want it, but emphasizing the importance of cohesion and doing something, I think that is a really promising way forward. And this is not the subject here, but you can kind of see that happening with the gun bill that the Senate's working at. So maybe there's some momentum going to, okay, these problems are too big, too important to just completely ignore. We can't fix them all with one bill, but maybe there's some momentum to at least do some things.
I think it's important to instill a sense of urgency here, because the train has left the station in terms of, from Beijing's perspective. They are out there executing on a strategy, and we have got to have a clear strategy that we are executing on as well. And I personally believe that there's going to be a real moment of danger in this competition where a lot of the investments we are making, particularly on the military side, in new capabilities and new technologies, are going to become manifest in the 2030s. I think right now Xi Jinping is pretty preoccupied with, his mishandling of COVID, the slowing down of the economy, the upcoming party Congress. But at some point, when he gets through all that, he's going to start thinking about Taiwan and how he wants to pursue Taiwan. He'll try political coercion, he'll try economic coercion, he'll try shrinking Taiwan's international space. But at the end of the day, this is a legacy issue for him. This is a must-do issue for him. And if he decides that I've got to use force, it's my last resort, but I have to use military force, he may look and say, if I wait, the longer I wait, the harder this is going to be for me, because U.S. capability is only growing. So we have a near to midterm deterrence problem. And so to me, that translates into really accelerating some of these digital capabilities to make sure that we can asymmetrically use our technological edge to cast doubt on the Chinese mind on whether they could be successful and how costly this would be. So this is key not only on the economic and diplomatic front. This is key to actually deterring a war in Asia, in my view. Not to overstate it, but I really believe that to be true.
So you talked about this, the problem we have in the near short term of deterrence, and I just want to follow up and ask you, what would success look like? What would the right amount of acceleration to be sufficient, not sufficient, but certainly to be in a much better place? What would need to look different, be different, I guess, in the country?
Well, I would say, first of all, we've got to define what is the democratic alternative to the Chinese model. And then we have to develop a strategy for really engaging like-minded states to accelerate its adoption or the sharing of that model internationally. Rule number one has to be actually showing up at these international fora where the future rules of the internet and rules of the road for digital governance are being decided. And we need to show up in force with our allies, arm in arm, alongside us. I was pleased that the administration has just nominated a first-time ever ambassador for cybersecurity and emerging technologies. I hope that he will get bipartisan support for a speedy confirmation, because that's really, really key for us showing up. We need to elevate the digital aspects of our diplomacy more broadly. It needs to be a key component of what we're offering, collaboration in the digital domain, whether it's digital trade treaties or provision of digital offerings. We need to really up our game there. And then we need to also invest in more cost-competitive, higher-performing alternatives to what China's offering. Huawei can't be the only viable alternative for these countries. And that will be led by the private sector, but again, it can be incentivized and helped along by targeted government incentives and investment. And then, I think on the military side, there's a huge transformation that's necessary to really move us into the cloud, a secure cloud environment, and to create a resilient network of networks where we can share information, control information, protect information, that really will give our decision makers huge advantage in both quality of information and to support their decisions and speed of decision. That will give us a tremendous advantage and kind of underwrite everything else in the future.
Yeah, I would say we already talked about resilient supply chains are important, and pursuing for critical technologies, whether it's chips or strategic minerals or whatnot, we need to pursue that. But not just make sure that we make them within the 50 states, but have our allies as a part of this resilient, reliable supply chain. And that's kind of a different way of thinking about it than we have traditionally done, but I think it's crucial. We can't do everything ourselves. We need to have that. We've also already talked about the importance of making it easier to bring all the players on the field from the private sector to participate in government. Another aspect of working with allies is to update our export policies. So we can make the best stuff in the world, but if we can't get it into the hands of allies and partners in a timely way, they're going to go where they can get it, and too often that's China. Michèle mentioned the Huawei telecommunications example. I think there are a lot where we are really hurting ourselves and our ability to compete with China by making it so difficult and so long to export things. Final thing I would say is nothing is as important as getting our act together here at home. And we can talk about education and training. We can talk about economic measures, all of which are very important. But it's not a coincidence, I think, that the focus of Russian disinformation has been to inflame controversial issues because they see the more we're divided, the better off they are. And the Chinese are watching and following that playbook too. So it's a matter of national security, economic security, that we get our act together here at home too.
So my personal thinking is that we're going to be in competition with China for quite a while going forward. And as I sort of mentioned before, as you've mentioned, they have many plans on many different levels. For more of the long term, do you have thoughts on what the U.S. long-term plan should be over the course of decades, and how we can begin thinking of how to really operationalize a plan, or even come up with a plan that can generate some level of consensus, like a long-term strategy? Any thoughts on that?
I would just say, in a way, the plan is to make our system work. We talked before, there are some inherent advantages that an autocracy has in trying to mobilize its resources and make things happen in the short term. But they have inherent disadvantages too. And so if you're talking about the long-term plan, it's to be consistent with our values, consistent with our fundamental principles, but also update those things to reflect digital technology, things that move at the speed of light, having a more challenging, diverse competitor, adversary than we've ever had before in our history. So I don't know that we need to take off on a Stalin-like 5 or 10 year plan. Our system has great advantages. We just need to make them work. And as I say, kind of get our own house more in order.
Yeah, I agree. But I think if we could set a few key priority outcomes to guide us. One is we want international standards that maintain a free, open, and more secure internet. There's some tension inside that, but I think a set of norms that are broadly recognized, with maybe China or Russia or a few others being the exception, but most of countries sign on to a set of digital norms that reflect our shared sense of values. That's one. Number two, maintaining our economic edge in terms of being able to compete across the digital domain in terms of our offerings, our products, our services. And so no country is left with the choice of, well, I can only go with China because that's the only option I have. And then on the military side, ensuring that we keep our edge not only in the cyber domain, but in this broader data and information utilization domain, and that includes probably AI as well, and ethical use of AI. And so, I think that's, there's just it's a very, and you could probably come up with other outcomes, but I think if we articulated 3, 4, 5 outcomes that are absolutely critical to really the global order and what kind of world we're all going to be living in the coming century, we could align a strategy behind that.
So now I think we're ready to maybe take a few questions from the audience for our guests here, and there's a microphone somewhere. So if you want to raise your hands, and how about in the back over there?
Hi, thank you so much. My question is, what is the role of Asian Americans as we compete with China? I think Valerie said something about that earlier, but as a Chinese American myself, I always, in doing national security work, competing with China can oftentimes be seen as, not trusting Chinese Americans. So yeah, just want your thoughts about how we should be treating and thinking about involving Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in the competition in China.
Can you share just your name and what you're where from?
My name is Siyu Mo, and I am from San Francisco, and but I'm actually a fellow for Senator Mark Warner.
Great. So I would say, the diversity of our population in the United States and the fact that we are, in at least in part, a nation of immigrants, should be a source of tremendous strength. The truth is we have many, many Americans who have the linguistic capability, the cultural familiarity, the experience abroad or with family abroad who actually can give us tremendous insight to understand something, a big question like, what will it take to deter China? Each country, each culture has a different set of views of how they look at the world, how they calculate strategic risk. What worked with the Soviet Union or with Putin's Russia doesn't necessarily work with Xi's, China. And so we should be leveraging that. And it's one of the areas that I think we've really gotten it backwards sometimes. And even if on a more practical level, on the economic side, if you look at Silicon Valley, and you look at the founders of that incredible, those companies that define that innovation ecosystem, half of them are either immigrants or first-generation Americans. We literally cannot innovate and compete on a global scale without drawing the world's best talent and encouraging people to make their lives here and pursue the American dream here. And that means some fundamental changes to our immigration and visa processes, frankly, if we're really going to leverage that strength, that attractive strength that we have as America for competing with China in the future.
Yeah, we need all the players on the field. Diversity is a tremendous strength, as Michèle said. And in addition, we put enormous resources over the course of the Cold War into studying the Russians, the Kremlin's mindset, what they're likely to do, deterrence, how that would work. We have not put that amount of effort, I don't think, into the Chinese, and we need to. And obviously, we need the best and the brightest to help us do that. I would just also say, back to our get something done that we can all agree on point. On immigration, it's going to be hard to solve all of those issues, but we came really close a couple of years ago to broadening out the number of people who we educate who could stay in this country, as just one example. And so looking for some of those ways to start to have an immigration system that makes sense for our economy, for our national security. I think there's some potential here that could also be some of those, let's do what we can agree on, even if we're going to disagree about some other things.
Yeah. Great. Any more? Over here? And if you could quickly introduce yourself and also.
Hi there, Chase Stewart, Army G2 ISR Task Force. Had a question. We talked about scaling problem with the Pentagon and getting more funding to tech companies. So just wanted to know if there's any plans to change the way this kind of stuff is funded, getting over the valley of death specifically. It's something that I work on, trying to get that technology through. So at that the strategic, very high level, what any kind of changes coming through, way to accelerate funding, any way to differently allocate funds for tech, obviously continuing resolutions, POM funding, budgeting, all cause issues.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I would say that, to start with, giving credit where credit is due, the department has gotten much better at scouting for technology, finding technologies to prototype and develop and kind of try out. But the challenge has been, moving those through to full-scale production and so forth. I think there are some pilot projects starting in the Pentagon to try to look at bridge funding, if Congress will agree, to help fund some of the continued development of the technologies until they become programs of record. And so there are some good pilot efforts being made. My personal view is that it's just not enough. It's not going to be at scale or fast enough, and that what we really need to do is create a separate acquisition approach for commercial technologies. Because if you try to run it through the military system, which spends years up front defining requirements, years, competing bids, years going through this waterfall of milestones, it just doesn't work with most of these technologies which have an agile development process and which are going to keep evolving even after procurement and need updates and so forth. So for truly commercial systems, I'd love to see a set of authorities that allow us to acquire them in a different way, and train acquisition professionals and incent them to, in that new approach, to really understand that. Because right now, our acquisition professionals see this as very high risk in terms of, high risk of failure, high risk to your career, why would I want to do that? And so a lot of the wonderful authorities that people like Representative Thornberry put in place for the department aren't really being used fully because people aren't incented to use them and they're afraid to use them. So I really think we need to, at this point, given the urgency, actually create a separate acquisition stream that's specifically for commercial technologies, which is most of the IT and digital stuff we're talking about, and train and incent a cadre within the acquisition corps to do just that and be expert at that. So that's what I would say. I would love to see the department go down that road.
And I'd agree that a lot of the challenge is cultural now, as well as budgetary. On that front, there's a couple of hopeful signs. There is a very small warfighter fund that the appropriators put into this appropriation bill, which doesn't have a lot of money, but it's that flexible funding kind of approach that is a hopeful start, and I think that they may be intending to grow it as it succeeds. Secondly, there is a commission that's been appointed to examine and propose reforms to the whole Pentagon budgeting process that McNamara brought in. So it's about time, you might say, but at least it's being looked at. But I guess my bottom line is I think what Michèle has laid out is exactly right. It's just a matter of common sense. You can't buy a tank and an aircraft carrier the same way you buy software. There's got to be a different approach, one that moves at commercial speed, and that sense of urgency that we've talked about a couple of times is the key thing that means you probably have to have a different authority to move out, because we need to keep working on revising what we got, but it's not going to be improved fast enough to meet the pace that the Chinese and others are setting for us.
Joe Piva, retired Army officer. I guess my question is, it's a new kind of warfare, right? So is there a danger in conflating, and even is the DoD the right tool for a war that has no, when you're talking about China, there's no good military option, right? That is an information and economic war almost in its entirety. versus a Russia that has force projection and given territorial desires, right? Like, how do we present that to the general public without conflating them in a way that's a little bit dangerous almost?
Yeah. No, and I mean, there's certainly digital modernization components to what we need to do for the military. But to your point, the bigger this, you know, the battle, if you will, is going to be fought in the information sphere, you know, before there's ever a, you know, an actual conflict, and hopefully we can deter that conflict. So it speaks to things like we need a true whole of government, whole of nation approach, really, to detect, deter, defeat foreign information operations. You know, to get much better at combating disinformation. I've been shocked by some of the statistics I've seen by how much of the media that Americans are reading, that Australians are reading, that, you know, Europeans are reading, stemmed from Russian sources like Sputnik. And it's Russian disinformation that gets picked up and rebroadcast in our media outlets. And suddenly you've got Americans, you know, thinking that Russian disinformation about what's happening in Ukraine is real, or in COVID, or whatever the issue is. So that's an area, and that is definitely not a DoD-led thing. That has got to be led by, you know, civilian side of the government. And similarly on the cybersecurity side, I do think that we're making some serious progress in improving the public-private sector collaboration in the 14 different areas of critical infrastructure in this country. We, you know, the strongest was initially the defense industrial base, the financial sector. Now we're moving post, you know, colonial pipeline hack, you know, into really looking at the energy infrastructure, the grid, and so forth. And I think that the urgency of having experienced some very substantial attacks in cyberspace is really motivating a new level of you know, of action and collaboration. You know, we're not there yet, but at least we're focused in the right direction. So I totally agree. This has to be, again, not just a whole of government approach, but really we need the private sector, we need American citizens, we need civic organizations to be part of this, particularly in dealing with disinformation and cyber threats.
And this is kind of part of what I was referring to a while ago when I say we tend to think in silos. And part of it stems from our view that government is limited and should be limited. And so this is their job, and this is the private sector job. And the Russians and the Chinese and others don't really see it that way. They use that whole of nation approach. So we're not going to become like them, but we do have to think differently about what national security is and how we're going to approach it, because they, as I mentioned, they are driving right at the heart of our democracy to try to divide us further. They don't really care which side of the issues you're on. As long as we're divided, they benefit. And so we're going to have to think, and I agree, DOD is not the answer to everything, and if we try to make DOD the answer to everything, they will become less competent for the things we really need them to. But at the same time, you got to get the other parts of government on a higher plane in dealing with these things. There's been meager attempts in Congress over the years to try to reorganize government agencies, you know, and so forth. I don't know. It would take so much time and effort. I don't see a short to mid-term solution other than leadership from the White House in focusing on the economic, the information, the military, the diplomatic, all of these domains that the other nations are able to integrate easier than we are.
And if I could just give you one example, I mean, we tend to do really much better in crisis, and then once the crisis is over, we kind of revert to our bureaucratic behaviors. But I'll give you an example. In the Ukraine, a lot of people have said, well, why hasn't there been more, have we seen more Russian cyber activity in the Ukraine crisis? And the truth is, there's a lot that's been going on, and one great example of that public-private cooperation, and I believe this has been reported now. I know this has been reported because that's how I read it. But you know, you had a situation where Russia used some malware that would be like wiping or erasing files of key institutions in Ukraine. They deployed the malware Our government detected it, shared the effect with Microsoft, and within 4 hours, Microsoft was able to develop a patch that went out to everybody in the Ukrainian government, so that malware became ineffective before it could spread. That is a classic example of public-private cooperation that actually has real impact on the ground. We need that not just in crisis or war. We need that every single day because we're under constant attack in this country through cyber.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Smalley of Cyberscoop. I have a question about NSPM 13. Recently there was a lot of press around defense losing some of its cyber ops authorities insofar as other agencies were kind of brought back into the process in a way they hadn't been since the Trump administration changed things in 2018. So I was just wondering if either of you have a reaction to that, or think Cyber Command is able to move as nimbly as it needs to. Some of the people I spoke with on those stories, like Ambassador Bolton, suggested that it's really going to hamstring Cyber Command not to be able to just move as quickly as it did before.
Yeah, I would just say I think it was a tremendous success to devolve some of the authority for making cyber decisions down to the military. Because if you have every sort of decision go up to the NSC and they debate the loss and the risk and all of this stuff, you will never move at the appropriate speed to deal with cyber. So clearly from a military standpoint, well, I'll say one other example I think was a tremendous success. If you compare the 2016 election and the 2020 election, it's a tremendous difference in the Russian ability to get their disinformation into the American public eyes and ears. So you got to be able to move at the appropriate speed. I don't know the details of this order and whether that is too much or whether it goes back to the days where everything seemed to go to the NSC, but you got to move at the appropriate speed when it comes to cyber operations, or they'll be completely ineffective.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also have to think about a more coherent and cohesive interagency approach, because a lot of times we're now seeing foreign adversaries using US-based servers to launch attacks, and there are and should be real limits for what our intelligence and military operators can do domestically inside the United States. And so I think, I look back to some of the most effective interagency organizations. I'll give you two examples. One was back in the, Bush and Clinton administrations, the Joint Interagency Task Force for Countering Drug Trafficking. You had you had the Coast Guard and the military and all of the civilian agencies, pooling authorities, coordinating activities, common operational picture, working together day in, day out at the operational level. We had something similar in counterterrorism, National Capital Region Joint Counterterrorism Task Force, that again brought all the intel folks, the FBI, law enforcement, DHS, DOD, state, everybody who needed Treasury needed to be involved, pooling authorities, pooling intelligence, and coming up with common approaches to attack the problem in real time. We need something like that in cyber, where we're getting out of these silos, put it all together, have people working shoulder by shoulder, day in, day out, and building the trust and building the operational concepts to move at the speed that we need to move. And yet, make sure we have the right policy and legal guardrails in place to not violate our own values or laws.
My name is Shirley Marty Hargis. I'm non-resident fellow at Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and Digital Forensic Research Lab. I have two questions. Speaking to, some of Valerie's points about the people-to-people approach, how can we move forward from, I know there's a lot of discussion about the China Initiative, and thankfully, that's where it's at now. But I would say the China Initiative was more of a mindset that can show up easily in different aspects. So my first question is, how do we address those concerns in such a way that Asian Americans feel safe to be able to help with the security aspects? Because no matter how long I've lived in China and Taiwan, I don't know all of the idioms. And there was an issue on online last year. Gosh, I wish I remembered the idiom, but it was mistranslated, and it seemed like it was China's going to get us tomorrow. And then there was a lot of talk from Asian Americans saying, no, actually, this is what it means. It's not speaking to attack. My second question is, when we're talking about the global South, I'm first generation American. My parents are from Ghana. And many times as I've spent the years, in the China space, Taiwan space, et cetera, nuanced things such as, maybe in America, we'll forget the country part, but, a vice president meeting a president of a country on the continent, things like that can soil the people-to-people connection that we could be building. So I know we're speaking about cyber, et cetera, but down to that cultural level that you were mentioning, both of you were speaking to,
Yeah.
how can we address that now so that when we are at the point where we can find an alternative to other countries seeking China out for their communications networks, et cetera, that we've already laid a really good foundation?
Well, let me take the first point, and I think it's incumbent upon American leaders in and outside of government to communicate with the American people that the Chinese people are not our enemy. Our problem is with the Chinese Communist Party and the autocratic rule, the government of China, and the way it's behaviors. It's oppression at home, it's violation of human rights at home, it's coercion and aggression abroad. And so I think, we have to have a sort of dialogue with the American people about where is really the problem. I also think this has to be addressed at the community and grassroots level. You've got to have dialogues at the community level so people can tell their story, so that people aren't sort of broad-brushed with sort of racist views or assumptions. So I think we have a lot of work to do. This is an area I'm worried about, because the more we do focus on China as a competitor that we're trying to keep from becoming a true adversary or enemy through various means, but a lot of people want more of a black and white. Are they an enemy or are they not? And if they're an enemy, then fine. Then anybody who looks like they could be from China, I'm going to be suspicious of, which is just not the answer for our country. It's the opposite of what we need to do in terms of leveraging people with linguistic and cultural and just other broader talents. I appreciated just your explaining the idiom of crouching. I can't count how many times my kids and I have watched that film and I never knew the meaning of the idiom. So, there's your contribution right there. But the point is, I am worried about this aspect. I also just will say one last thing on the China point. However intense this competition is, another thing that worries me is there's no room for cooperation right now, politically. And we have areas where we have to politically cooperate with China. Climate change, preventing the next pandemic, preventing proliferation from North Korea, for example. There are no kidding, vital national security interests that we have that we cannot achieve or protect without some level of cooperation with China. We have got to figure out how to integrate that into our policy. And I know the administration has tried, and God bless John Kerry, who's over there just constantly trying to work with the Chinese. But right now the Chinese government has said, no, everything's connected to everything. You want cooperation, we're going to use that as leverage and not give it to you until you give us something else. That is a recipe for ending up in a very bad place in things like climate.
I agree. I would just add, in addition, I referred earlier to updating our export laws. Are there Chinese investors who want to invest in companies in the United States in order to steal the technologies and take it? Yes. So we need to be smarter about that. We also need to be smarter about our counterintelligence capabilities. Yeah. Not everybody that looks us, I agree completely with Michèle, you can't go on looks. Do they try to send spies over here? Of course they do. So do the Russian, you know, all sorts of people. So but we are really behind in using the more updated methods of trying to sort through that. On your second point, I think person-to-person contact, leader-to-leader or otherwise, is just as important when it comes to the digital aspect as it is to other aspects. Because what we started out talking about and what the third way paper talks about is these are two competing systems here. And we want to show people that we're interested in them and help persuade them that our system is a better one for them and their future and their lives. So I think the Biden administration has done a very good job of engaging more with the world. We need to show up. And they've done a much better job of that, which is very important. If you've got some harsh things to say it behind closed doors. You don't have to say it in front of the camera. But showing up and smiling, you know, and shaking hands in front of the camera is a very big help.
And with that, I think we're ready to move on to our panel session. So everyone, please thank our wonderful speakers, Thornberry and Michèle Flournoy.
Hello, hello, hello. Perfect. I got one. Wonderful job. Thank you so much for showing up. While our panelists get ready, I'd like to first thank Michèle Flournoy and Representative Thornberry for being here with us today, and of course Valerie as well. Wonderful job. Ruth, you can come on stage. Here's perfect. If you want to stay engaged with our work with Third Way's national security team, you can tweet us at thirdwaynatSec. If you are interested in some of the research and the projects that we're doing on the national security team that Michèle and Representative Thornberry mentioned, including our recent strategy report to launch this event, you can find us at www.thirdway.org/issue/national security. Again, that's www.thirdway.org/issue/national security. My name is Jason Browder. As Valerie had mentioned, I am the Senior Policy Advisor for National Security at Third Way, and I help to lead the U.S.-China Digital World Order Program. I'm a former Hill staffer. I was the National Security Advisor to Congressman Beto O'Rourke, former Fulbright Presidential Management Fellow in the Office of Management and Budget at the National Security Division. And most recently, I was the Assistant Dean at New York University, Abu Dhabi. We're honored for you all to be here, particularly those who are online, and to host these incredible national security leaders and women leaders. Diversity of thought is extremely important to us. Empowering women is extremely important to us, and as you can tell by the individuals that we had, fireside chat and the panel itself. That would include Deputy Assistant Secretary Ruth Berry, Third Way's very own former Senior Vice President for National Security, Mieke Eoyang, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber, and then a dear friend and former colleague, Carole House, who is the current Director for Cyber and Digital at the National Security Council at the White House. So let's just jump in. So to begin, we really need to appreciate the macro environment to understand China, its strategy for digital authoritarianism. And we unfortunately can't do that without first discussing China's positioning and strategy since the catastrophic and unprovoked war between Russia and Ukraine. I'm going to start off with Mieke. If you put your DoD hat on, if you can paint a picture for our audience for what Russia's invasion of Ukraine has on the appeal of China and its authoritarianism, and if there are any specific examples, whether that's maybe Taiwan or specific capabilities. And then Ruth, if you would follow up and maybe add some context, specifically China's digital authoritarianism strategy from where you sit with the new Digital and Cyber Bureau at State Department.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. And it's great to be back here at Third Way and to see everyone again. And I really appreciate this effort because I do think that this is the core challenge for the United States in the coming decades and probably for the remainder of our lives. In the new National Defense Strategy, we talk about China as the pacing threat, and we very much recognize that the competition and tensions between the U.S. and China will define U.S. national security policy for quite some time to come. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is tremendously important for what China is going to do on the world stage. Whether or not a country succeeds in changing self-governance by force, or whether or not they pay an unacceptable price for trying to do so, is a core question in China's calculus. If Russia is able to take Ukraine and not pay a significant price for that, that emboldens other countries who think that they might be able to do the same. And we see in this Russia attempt to try and take Ukraine, the reaction of the world, and the just strong response from countries around the world who have no direct security stake in the situation, but are willing to impose costs on Russia to show how unacceptable it is, all the way around the world, right, from countries in NATO all the way to Japan. And so we see that change in export controls, in sanctions, in assistance to Ukraine, that around the world people really recoil at the idea of trying to forcibly change the self-governance of a people. The lessons that we see in this Russia-Ukraine conflict and what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine, the cyber dimensions of that are incredibly important to us, especially in the Defense Department, to understand what the playbook might be if another cyber-capable country were to attempt to do this. And some of the things that we see, some of which has been reported publicly, may form parts of China's playbook and are really important for us to understand. The ways that the Russians tried to kick Ukraine, or make Ukraine go dark with the Viasat disruption, with much of the malware that was occurring across Ukraine, attempts to try and disrupt basic government function. And the U.S. is working very hard to try and help Ukraine preserve not only its physical security, but it's also its digital security. Attempts, and this was reported recently, by Russia within occupied territories in Ukraine to force traffic back through Russian networks where it will be subject to the kind of filtering and censorship that the Russian people experience day to day. The challenges that the technology industry has, both in Russia and Ukraine, in terms of what the effect is of the workforce on trying to flee from conflict or trying to leave the country in objection taking place, and then the export controls and the long-term impact that has on Russia. These are all factors that need to go into our calculus, but at the same time, I'm sort of hesitant to draw too many conclusions here because this is a conflict that is still ongoing. We don't know what the end stage will be yet, so it's a little bit hard to draw total lessons learned because something could happen today, tomorrow, in the weeks to come that may make us rethink how influential this is. And as we learn lessons, as the Chinese look at this to learn lessons, I think things will change, may change further as this conflict unfolds.
Thank you. You know, I think China's efforts in the international stage when it comes to exporting digital authoritarianism is a huge concern. And I can talk a little bit about sort of what they're doing, but also more importantly, what this administration is doing about it. But first, I want to say that technology competition, I think, is one of the defining foreign policy challenges for the coming decades. But we are not a competition with the Chinese people, and it's really important that we're clear about the fact that this is related to the Chinese Communist Party and their actions and activities that are authoritarian or oppressive, and not just what they're doing around the world, but what they're doing at home to censor and oppress the Chinese people. And so I just want to make sure that that's really clear as we go into this discussion. Through the digital Silk Road, China is seeking to export digital connectivity around the world, but with it, some of the really digital authoritarianism as well. And so thinking about a lot of the things that the previous panelists touched on, which is how do we have a plan to help combat that and offer democratic choices to our partners and allies. And I think there's a few areas that we're really focused on. One is partnership. We're working very closely with like-minded partners around the world to promote a positive vision for the future of the internet. And you see that with the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, with work in the Quad, which is the US, India, Japan, Australia, and a lot of work in standards bodies. So we heard the previous panels talk about how China is working in international standard setting bodies to rewrite the rules of the road for the future of the internet. That's something that we're working very closely together with our partners. Another effort I'll mention is the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which was launched with nearly 60 countries who reaffirmed and recommitted themselves to an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet, and one that is also continues to be governed by multi-stakeholder approaches that include industry, civil society, the private sector. I think one thing we also see the PRC do is try to bring technical controls of the internet into multilateral forums that are government-driven rather than multi-stakeholder. And so that's another area where we're working very closely with our partners and allies. The International Telecommunication Union has its plenipotentiary conference in a few months. They will elect a new Secretary General, and the United States is very pleased to support Doreen Bogdan-Martin as the candidacy for that. And I think that's critical to ensuring that the ITU continues to deliver on its core mandate for countries around the world, but doesn't sort of stray into other areas or become a battleground for some of these more authoritarian efforts. And then the last thing I'll mention, and happy to get into more detail on any of these things, is the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership, which was launched in 2018. And that's really a whole of government effort that the US government is doing, is to offer alternatives to secure and reliable connectivity around the world, both in terms of our financing and export credit tools, but also training and capacity building to help create an enabling environment that supports a vibrant digital economy, but one that is in line with and respects for human rights. And so there's a lot that the United States is doing in close cooperation with its partners and allies to really offer these positive visions. And I think that these efforts need to continue.
And we're definitely going to get into some of this partner building. I want to dive a little deeper into China's strategy response post the Ukraine-Russian war. And this would be to you, Carole. Bonnie Lin, who's the Senior Fellow of Asian Security Studies at CSIS, testified in Congress recently about the Ukraine crisis strengthened China's desire to be more self-reliant. This is specifically on manufacturing and technology, more resilient industrial supply chains, and pushing for chip production, self-sufficiency, and more investment in key strategic sectors such as artificial intelligence. And I'm curious, Carole, working at the NSC, do you agree with this assessment? And if so, what is the United States strategy to compete?
Great. Well, first, just wanted to state how much, what a joy it is to be up here working alongside two powerhouses that have been leading a lot of our digital policy efforts, and Ruth, whom I worked with at the NSC, driving a lot of the efforts that she just spoke to. So I just wanted to give her a shout out for that. But well, first, continue to reinforce Miike's comments about the kinds of potential lessons that we can see from Putin's and Russia's continued invasion into Ukraine, the devastating consequences that are being wrought there, but then also the consequences that the international community is coming together to impose upon Russia, and specifically the regime and those who have propped up this kind of destabilizing activity and continued invasion of Ukraine's sovereignty. So I think that there's nothing more that I can really add there, because Mieke covered it really holistically. But I mean, we have been imposing these consequences on Russia for good reason, and we are cutting them off from access to innovative technologies and imposing these financial consequences because of the decisions that have been made to violate their sovereignty and the kinds of principles that really underlie the United Nations and just responsible behavior on the international stage. However, because of that, understood that other nations may potentially see that if the rest of the world, like-minded nations, those that are committed to respecting sovereignty, to respecting democracy, may come together and be able to impose really devastating consequences on malicious actors, then there may be lessons that they're trying to glean from that and figure out how to be more self-sufficient. But I will say that we're not trying to cut off China from the international stage. We're simply trying to pursue the strategy that we put forward in Secretary Blinken's speech recently, that really underscored that our approach with China, our strategic framework, is one focused on investment and alignment, as well as posturing to compete. So ultimately, I think that that's where you're going to continue to see our efforts. It's focusing on how to invest in our own capabilities. The president signed into law the most significant investment in infrastructure in history last year. We're going to continue to invest in critical and emerging technologies that will better enable our ability to compete with China and others. But we're going to have to continue to, I think Secretary Blinken said, deal with each other for the time being. So I think that's right. But we're going to continue to invest in our own innovative technologies and our own workforce. We're also going to align with international partners. A lot of the partnerships that we've announced, like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that allow for us to work with like-minded partners to enable a resilient economy, a clean economy, a connected one, and a fair one that also combats issues like corruption. So I think the United States approach is going to continue to invest in our partnerships, like what Ruth spoke to, and work to make sure that we are working with our partners to invest in the kinds of capabilities that will ensure that we stay at the forefront on the digital stage.
So there's a general consensus among practitioners that China's digital mastery effectively has harmed democracy overall, particularly its exportation of digital authoritarianism. The German Marshall Fund released a report last week that said the Chinese government is deploying a digital technology combination of governance standards, hardware, software, and protocols to suppress liberal democracy. We've heard from Michèle earlier, and you mentioned it as well, sort of setting these standards. So for you, Ruth, what are the important steps that the United States and its allies and partners can take to shape digital standards in prominent standard-setting bodies?
Thank you. It's a good question, and it's one that this administration has spent a lot of time thinking about, and is a focus of a lot of the conversations with our partners and allies. So in the US and EU Trade and Technology Council, there's an entire working group devoted to closer cooperation on standards bodies, including the establishment of sort of an early warning system, where if there are particular proposals or elections or other activities that are taking place in some of these technical standards bodies, that there's sort of a system in place for these very technical practitioners within governments to talk to each other and alert to each other. I think it's really important maintaining the voluntary, private sector driven consensus-based nature of standards bodies, where the best proposals win based on their technical merits. And so when we think about how do we ensure that the US and others lead in those bodies, it really comes down to research and development, so that we do have the best proposals to put forward in these standards bodies. I think avoiding efforts to bring technical protocols of the internet into multinational bodies such as the UN or the ITU is another area. So China's pushed multiple times this idea of new IP at the ITU and other fora, but the US and like-minded partners have been successful in pushing back on those efforts and ensuring that it continues to remain in sort of ICANN and other multi-stakeholder bodies that include the private sector and others. I think bringing countries on board who are either emerging markets is really important as well. I think having the G7, the US and Europe sort of writing the rules of the road for the 21st century comes at our peril. And I think creating a more inclusive and democratic processes that bring in emerging countries who will have incredible innovation over the coming decades and be the users and deployers of so much of this emerging technology is also really important. And so I think that's another important area of focus for the United States as we think about how do we engage with our partners and allies on a positive vision for the future of the internet in the coming decades.
Yeah, if it's okay for me to chime in, just another area, because the issue of standards are so important. Of course, all the forums that Ruth spoke to are just critical, but I have to talk about the digital asset work that the administration is driving well, and why the components that we're looking at under the international engagement framework and the competitiveness strategy and trying to drive standards there, I think are going to be so important. So digital assets, the market has significantly grown, also shrunk a bit of late, but the president recognizes that digital asset technologies can be really transformational. There are significant risks in the space related to market protections, consumer protections, anti-money laundering, financial stability. There's also concerns around issues like state surveillance and integrating in the future of money or the future of these systems that allow for a commingling of the pipes that allow for information transfer and the future internet, along with the future of value transfer and the future financial system, the need for making sure that democratic principles are being built into digital assets and underlying distributed ledger technology infrastructure. So with all of that, after the issuance of the executive order from President Biden in early March on ensuring responsible development of digital assets, there's a lot of efforts right now underway by the administration to put together an international engagement framework, which includes requirements for agencies to identify the international forum where we need to be prioritizing our engagement to drive the kinds of standards that will respect and reflect democratic principles, including things like countering, corruption and illicit finance, but also driving in issues like ensuring appropriate privacy while reflecting appropriate discoverability that should exist in a financial system. So there's lots of opportunities there to continue to drive standards, as well as look for partnerships on the international stage to look at where we need to be working together to shape what the future of money looks like and explore these opportunities for cross-border payments.
Great answers. I could go many ways with this, but in particular, a topic that's garnered a lot of attention is sort of this U.S.-China decoupling. So you can talk about that in the digital asset space, on what China did with miners or the CDBC, the digital yuan. And there's, I think, a divergent of approaches as well to the decoupling. There's John Bateman, who's a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment, argues sort of against the defensive approach that Trump administration foreign policies had. And recently a Washington Post editorial actually argues for them, in particular Hikvision, in sanctioning them. So this is for the group. What is the strategy around China and the U.S. decoupling? Specifically, does the Biden administration continue to support more defensive foreign policy strategies, whether that's tariffs and sanctions on Chinese companies such as Huawei or as I mentioned, Big Vision. And if not, would you be able to expand?
Well, I'll just highlight, can't preview anything specific here other than the actions that we've already taken, but we'll continue to look at the appropriate controls that we need for our exports and the right policy measures that we need to put in place to protect American sensitive data, consistent with the executive order that the president signed last year. However, I think that the U.S. approach is really the one I know that I outlined before, one that's proactively seeking for opportunities to invest in our own technologies to ensure that we maintain and leverage the competitive advantages that the U.S. economy and the U.S. population and our democracy really enable us to uniquely leverage and drive. And you're seeing it in the investments that we're trying to drive in quantum computing, in artificial intelligence, in biotechnology, the critical emerging technologies list that the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Security Technology Council published earlier this year, or I think, apologies, I think it was last year, that pointed to critical technologies like financial technologies, including digital assets and digital identity infrastructure. All of these kinds of things are the sorts of technologies that we're going to continue to try to invest in, build our own capacity in, make sure that our markets maintain competitiveness, that we're leveraging the benefits of the U.S. workforce. We're making those investments in workforce, in jobs and training to make sure that we can stay at the forefront. But we will continue to align with our partners and then drive to compete with with Chinese markets, and of course continue to push our vision for a non-authoritarian future of the internet.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is when we talk about these things, there's a sort of temptation to say that this is about a made in China label versus a made in US label. And it really is about the difference in technology approaches and what that means for us from a security perspective. Right? When Chinese technology products have hard-coded into them censorship filters, right? So that if you buy a phone, and I was just in Lithuania where our colleagues there had gone through and done the technical analysis to show that in Chinese devices they had found censorship technology embedded in them, so that it's not just if you buy the device, it's just like made in the US versus made in China. It is exporting a certain kind of repression with the device, which is an external expansion of their own internal need to control the population, what the population says and thinks. If it were not that kind of a technology, if it were sort of a level playing field on that, it would be different. If the technology, if the data were on Americans were not being sent back to China. From the Defense Department perspective, this becomes a national security risk where the data of US government personnel, if it's being sent back to China, is a challenge. If our allies are adopting Chinese network technology, it puts a lid on how much cooperation we can have with them and how much information we can share with them because of our concerns about visibility onto the networks. This is not just about labels of one country versus another. It is about the kind of technology that we're talking about here that poses a security risk to the United States.
In continuation on the topic of decoupling, Scott Malcolmson, the author of the book Splinternet, argues that the internet of the future will be an internet of balkanization. You can see this with Chinese government erected the Great Firewall for political reasons. The Russian government has enacted a sovereign internet law that allows it to partition itself from the rest of the internet. The US and its partners have also discussed plans to create similar firewalls. This would be to block child pornography or weapon-making instructions. Ruth, and then maybe Carole after that. In regards to the balkanization and U.S. companies working abroad, can the U.S. counter China throwing its weight to make American companies self-censor? And two, are we able to push back on China's ability to basically coerce U.S. companies into tailoring speech or curtailing speech to the ideology and imperatives of the CCP?
Sure. Well, first, I don't know that I would say that our policy is one of decoupling with China. China is integral to the global economy and to our ability to solve challenges from climate to COVID to the opioid crisis. And so the United States and China will have to deal with each other for the foreseeable future. That being said, there are areas that are critical to U.S. national and economic security where the United States will work with its partners and allies to do what we have to do to protect ourselves. And so I think it really falls into this idea of both a protect and a promote strategy. And so I talked when I opened about some of the things we're doing to promote a positive vision, to cooperate with our partners and allies, but there's quite a lot that's being done on the protect side as well, whether it's export controls, protection for U.S. intellectual property, or supply chain security. How are we thinking about critical global supply chains? When it comes to this idea of the balkanization of the internet, the PRC absolutely uses economic coercion against global businesses and foreign governments alike to try to shift their behavior. And when the PRC threatens to block market access for American companies because what it says or does here at home, such as standing up for human rights, that's a clear distinction from the values that inform their relationships with the private sector versus the US relationship with the private sector. And so we encourage all US companies to remember their responsibility to respect human rights under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and that this also applies to their public statements related to the PRC. I think in the balkanization of the internet and how we think about harmful content or illegal content online is a huge challenge, and one that democracies need to work together to figure out how to address. The United States and the 60 partners that signed the Declaration for the Future of the Internet all recommitted to a global, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet that enables citizens all over the world to communicate with each other, that embodies competition and connectivity, supports human rights. But the reality is this vision has been under attack, and China is building its own internet with a Great Firewall. So I think the way that we can best combat that is to continue to double down and ensure that partners around the world, governments, commit themselves to this vision and to taking actions that support it. And that includes, as I've mentioned several times, a commitment to the multi-stakeholder governance of the internet.
Yeah, not much more to add except just continuing to drive our work on the international stage, investment in the multi-stakeholder process, driving some of our investments like through the DCCP and the Digital Invest effort that I know USAID announced $3 million, I think, earlier this year to be able to help accelerate $300 million in private capital, I think, to help drive secure network solutions around the world. I think that continuing to leverage those partnerships and that special relationship that the U.S. benefits from with our industry is really the way that we move forward. And since I'll tag back to something that Mieke really pointed out, is continuing to expose where we see some of this malicious activity happening, where we see surveillance technology existing and then being exported globally, where we see malicious cyber activity like that we exposed in an unprecedented way with a huge group of partners last summer, and China's use of criminal contract hackers in order to conduct malicious cybercrime activity like ransomware. We'll just continue to maintain transparency and leverage our approach and the benefits of a democratic system and all of our like-minded partners to hold accountable these actors and continue to reinforce to American industry that we need to maintain our commitment to protecting human rights.
So this will be the last question, so we'll have time to open it up for some Q&A. And this is basically how the administration would hope to engage with policy members. So a bipartisan set of House and Senate lawmakers are proposing a new compromise for government screening of American investments in China as part of a pending economic competitiveness bill. In your view, how has the administration or your office best engaged with policymakers to craft effective technology-focused competitiveness? And this could include cyber, data acquisition, sanctions, and or policies that create an ecosystem here to really harness the incredible talent in the U.S.
Well, I'll start on competitiveness since I referenced the digital asset EO earlier, because right now the Department of Commerce, which also has a request for comment out right now, so I hope all of you will submit a comment, but they are developing the first ever competitiveness framework for the US on digital assets and their underlying technologies. So of course, more to follow on what that will actually include and look at, but competitiveness includes some of the protect but also promote elements, and a lot of that's going to be looking at what we need to do for investments and supporting research and development. So not just making sure that the agencies that have some of the powerhouse R&D authorities are actually pointed to the issue sets, but that they're also resourced to do so. So I know that there have been some bills that have been that have been proposed so far, and we continue to look forward to working with Congress to fully resource some of those efforts to make sure that we can properly invest. But I think looking at the policy issues, the key authorities that can have the highest impact on the most critical technology areas, since of course we're always going to be somewhat resource constrained. So we need to make sure that we're investing in the right workforce and talent, and also the right providing the right resources to be able to support grants, as well as in-house U.S. government R&D that can help to promote industry development. I'll turn it over to Mieke and Ruth.
I'll defer to Ruth on this one because I feel like the competitiveness stuff is less of a
Sure. I mean, I think there's a number of pieces of legislation that, change names frequently. So, whether it's the CHIPS Act, or formerly known as USICA, or the America Competes Act, all of those have really important funding to help as we think about sort of building this economic future for the United States, where we are competitive in the technology space and leaders in the technology space. And so I think just one example I'll give is, there's funding in these proposed bills to support Open RAN, open radio access networks, research and development. And I think this touches back to something our previous panelists had said about the importance of offering alternatives to telecommunications companies such as Huawei and ZTE. And so right now, the market is dominated by traditional network vendors who offer sort of a closed stack. But with network virtualization and open radio access network architectures, you can build a lot more modularity into the networks, and there can be a lot more companies that compete by offering discrete pieces of it. And this really offers the opportunity to both drive down costs, but create a lot more innovation and competition in the telecommunications network infrastructure space, and therefore create a lot more resilience and security. And so, but this takes investments, and I think, CapEx investments in telecommunications networks are very high, spectrum is very high, and so a lot of telecommunications companies would welcome, including in the developing countries, the ability to deploy network infrastructure at a lower cost, but one that doesn't sacrifice their security. So I think that's just one important example. There's also funding in these bills for the State Department for foreign assistance to bolster our efforts on providing assistance on innovation and telecommunications security around the world. So I think funding is really important as we think about how we compete going forward.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something that Ruth just said about assistance, because I think it is really important. We in the Defense Department are also thinking about how we leverage security cooperation tools to try and strengthen networks of partners and allies around the world. And one of the things that we've seen in the Ukraine crisis is that when they faced disruption, that they had a multitude of internet service providers on the ground, gave them a lot of redundancy and resilience in their network traffic. Having a more vibrant, robust, competitive technology space allows you to weather disruption a lot more easily. So how we think about doing some of those things, how we work together with the State Department to try and improve networks of partners and allies around the world, this is another thing where we can try and bring U.S. technology solutions to bear as we work to strengthen partners around the world.
Thank you. And with that, we'll open it up for a couple of questions.
Hi, yeah, I'm Gabe Royal. I'm a PhD student at GW studying digital asset public policy. My question is with regard to, we mentioned the digital yuan and their central bank digital currency and their penchant for economic coercion. My question is there a sense in your offices or government more generally that we need to be taking a more defensive or proactive approach to kind of this combination of the potential for highly surveillable, non-transparent currency and the potential that they could possibly coerce corporations that we do business with or are based out of the US to put highly surveillable currency in the People's Bank of China's coffers? Or is it more, we just need to be focused on developing better options here at home? Thank you.
I'll take that one, at least at first, and anyone else tag on. So first, I'll highlight that because I've gotten this question before, that the digital asset EO that was issued was not done specifically in response or pointed to any particular nation or effort. Both Russia and China came up as questions, and it was a long, ongoing effort that then led to launching of the EO. However, it's not done in a vacuum, and the U.S. government is very aware of and certainly noting and monitoring all the developments in central bank digital currencies, as well as private cryptocurrencies worldwide, and driving a multi-prong approach on that front to be able to address some of the significant risks, but then also, like I mentioned, leverage the positive potential benefits, like reinforcing the U.S. role within the financial system, as well as driving U.S. competitiveness and driving the U.S. as a home for innovation in fintech and other emerging technologies. Related to the ECNY, China's central bank digital currency, CBDC, we would certainly note that given China's historical record for engaging in things like economic coercion, for privacy violations and human rights abuses, we would certainly advise anyone who's looking to leverage the ECNY or partner with them to consider the potential risks. And most importantly, on the promote side, look to principles like the G7 principles for retail CBDCs that the G7 issued that pointed to important fundamental principles like human rights, like maintaining privacy. So I think not able to preview any specific actions there, but I think that what we definitely need to pay attention to is working with other democracies and other like-minded nations to figure out what does the future of that money look like. The risks as well as the benefits of cryptocurrencies all really depend on the design. They can be incredibly transparent. They can also be incredibly obfuscated. Some of the key challenges with why crypto has enabled the rise of ransomware is because of insufficient identity being built into these ecosystems and insufficient regulatory controls like bolting identity on at the KYC level with these exchanges. So there's definitely ways to try to design a system that enables protection of privacy, also can enable lawful discoverability and due process and all the other kinds of factors that you want into an ecosystem. We believe that, hence why we're trying to drive competitiveness and responsible development of the technologies. So on the U.S. side, we certainly have not taken the approach that China did of prohibiting private cryptocurrency activity in the nation. We're instead trying to promote responsible development of it on the industry side, and then also have established with the utmost priority research and development into a U.S. option, a U.S. central bank digital currency. That continues to build on and reinforce efforts that have long been ongoing at the Federal Reserve. But now we're actually currently, the White House is leading an assessment on the technology needs and capacity needs for a U.S. CBDC. So I think that we're definitely going to continue to look at what we need to drive on the U.S. industry side for responsible innovation, on the U.S. government side to examine whether or not a U.S. CBDC is in the nation's interest, and then to determine what the right actions are from there.
Hi guys, my name is Travis Numhard. I work for DC government in a compliance space. I'm more of a defense enthusiast. So my question is, given China's economic and global prowess, heavily reliant on its population and the challenges that it's facing around its prior one-child policy, it has since expanded into the African continent, making inroads, economic investments, telecommunication investments, that sort of thing. What inroads or steps have we taken as a country to tap into the African continent for that kind of a national security consideration? I know we made many investments in Latin America, building relationships sort of thing, but we don't hear as much going on in the African continent as much, and so would love to hear your perspectives on that.
Sure. I mean, I think the African continent is an incredible source of innovation and economic growth for the coming century, and one that is a high priority to look at how we can partner with those countries for this administration. You know, there's a long-standing program on Power Africa that I think enables a lot of cooperation in the power sector. There's also Prosper Africa, which looks at how do we leverage the U.S. private sector to engage in helping build some of the development needs. And I would say that under this administration in particular, looking at Digital Africa and how do we work to help increase connectivity in countries in Africa is also a high priority. So I think there's a lot of work being done there. But you know, we're never going to have the same model that China has, where you know you have heavily subsidized equipment or industries that are essentially given away for free or through debt trap diplomacy. We are very focused on responsible and sustainable development and creating ecosystems that can sustain and take advantage of these advancements. And so sometimes it's not as fast or as visible as some of the Chinese investments, but you know, a lot of what we try to talk to countries about, particularly in the telecommunications space, is free isn't free. So what are you getting in what is the Chinese government or you know, Huawei or these companies getting in exchange for this equipment that's so far below market rate? Like what drives that and what's behind it and what is being sacrificed in terms of security or sovereignty in that space? But it's certainly a very important area of focus.
We have time for one more question.
Sean Lingus with CNN. Thanks for being here. Great discussion. I guess this is probably a question for Mieke and Ruth, but also Carole too, if she wants. The benefit of hindsight, looking back on what the U.S. government has done in support of Ukraine, cyber defenses in the months before the war and continuing through the present day. I know that you talked a bit about the successes. I'm wondering if you could put your critical, self-critical caps on a little bit and talk about what, with the benefit of hindsight, you might have done differently to help Ukraine. Obviously, there's a number of fronts of assistance, incident response, analysis, Cyber Command's role. Is there anything that you would have done differently knowing what you know now?
Yeah, appreciate the question, because I think it's easier to point to things that one has done and talk about the impact that that's had than the challenge that we've had. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I see, not just with Ukraine, but with cyber across, as we build partners and allies more generally, is cyber is an area that's not just a defense priority. Previous panel talked about how it crosses silos, and this is one of those areas where, right, as we in the Defense Department seek to work with our counterparts in other countries, they may or may not have any responsibility for the networks inside their territories. And so for that, we have to work with the State Department, we have to work with USAID to be able to understand how that comes together. Because cyber comes together in a whole of government way across agencies with all these different responsibilities, it makes it hard to have a single point of contact as to who to talk to and how we approach those things. And I think this is something that we're learning during the conflict, and I think it's a challenge. I think it's also a challenge because a lot of countries don't really understand what their cyber needs are. So they're not making the kind of clear and coherent asks of the US government that really understand what they need and what their steps are in their development based on where they are. So I think this is an area where coordination across the government is something that will continue to improve as we go forward. But we're learning along the way.
And I think that's exactly right. And I think taking the sort of telecommunications and network infrastructure as sort of a case point, it's how do we surge to effectively keep the lights on, but to keep communication flowing when there is a conflict and networks may be taken down, or as in Europe, many telecommunications networks will have a parent a parent company headquartered somewhere else making a lot of network decisions with a subsidiary in a particular country. And so how do we work together to ensure that critical access to communication continues? I think thinking too about the sort of the sanctions that the US and then our allies imposed upon Russia for this unprovoked war of aggression, how can those occur in a way that also doesn't cut off the Russian people's access to information? And how do we sort of balance those two things are things that I think have also been really important and things that we've learned by doing. in this process, and also thinking about, you know, misinformation and harmful content online that's being spread, that's either, you know, causing harm to the people of Ukraine, or things related to the food insecurity being blamed on U.S. or like-minded sanctions, when in fact, you know, there are other supply chain issues. And so thinking about how do we as like-minded countries better address those sort of things in the future. So I think, as she said, this isn't over yet, but I think of course there's always a lot of opportunity for learning and reflecting on how things are handled in crisis in order to better understand how to respond in the future.
With that, I'd like to thank our incredible women and national security leaders for being here today. Thanks everyone who was able to join us in person and online. And with that, we will conclude the event.